Sertima.
My lecture to you tonight is based on the book I edited in 1983, Blacks in Science, Ancient and Modern. But what I intend to do is a series of 3 lectures. Tonight I will deal with Africans and African Americans in the field of science and invention, and I will also touch on some of the latest researches and discoveries in Africa. When I come again in April, I will deal with Egyptian science, and finally in May, I will deal with Moorish science. One of the things that astonished me, I was invited by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration a week ago to be the keynote luncheon speaker to the scientists who are at the moment involved in a brand new program, because with the success of the new space probes, NASA is getting a new lease of life, and they seriously intend to send rockets to almost all the planets in our solar system, with the possible exception of Pluto, by the end of this century. And there are lots of ambitious projects, etc. And I was invited to keynote the conference about a week ago. And one of the things that astonished me is that even though you have there the most brilliant brains in the world, they are totally ignorant of what has happened in the past in terms of what Africa contributed to the science of the world. One of the scientists, for example, was speaking to me at great length when we were in the car about von Braun, how we took half of the Hitler scientists and the Russians took the other half in order for us to make the jump into space, because the Nazi scientists had gone further than anyone else in developing rockets. And that we had to build on that, and then afterwards we developed our own scientific program. But the great fear is that after major breakthroughs in science, we are at a situation in which they have become extremely afraid, because 1/3 of the scientific force has retired. These are men who belong to another men and women who belong to another generation, and they've reached a point now where they're not sure they can continue what they have started. In fact, so great is the fear, so desperate the situation, that they're now trying to build smart computers that will house the brains of the earliest scientists. By that is meant not the literal flesh, because the brain dies, you cannot capture anything by holding the brain itself, but to capture all the data. But not just simply to store that data, but to be able to activate it in such a way that not just the knowledge, but the insights of earlier scientists will be there. The computer will be able to make certain decisions based upon that knowledge, based upon those insights. I do not know if that is possible. That is where the machine really falls down, no matter how smart it becomes. It can only go a certain point and no further. That is why we really need the human resource. And one of the points that was made by the head of NASA at that conference is the recognition that the 21st century belongs to minorities, what they call minorities, okay? And that if we are to sustain our advances in science, it will depend on how many blacks, Hispanics, etc. enter the field of science seriously within the next few years. We are in such a position, we're receiving now 5,000 pages of data per second from outer space. We do not know what to do with it, because we do not have enough scientists in this country to process the information we're getting. In other words, we've built these incredible machines that are going in all of these places, and they're picking up data, but they do not know how to deal with that data, because we do not have enough scientists to analyze the data. And I was very struck years ago in 1983 when I was flown to Cape Kennedy to witness the blast off of the space shuttle, the first space shuttle that was to throw a black American into space. And the day before the blast off, I had a chance to meet many of the black scientists. In fact, that day was dominated by black scientists and their great lectures, both men and women. And I met a boy there. Well, he was a young man, but still a boy, not yet 20. And he had sent the first ant colony into space. This is a black boy from a very obscure little school in Camden, New Jersey. And some years ago, when I was doing studies of blacks in science, even before I brought this book out, I gave a lecture to his school. And he was very fascinated by the lecture. And when I mentioned that the cargo bay of the space shuttle is open to amateur experiments, he took that very seriously and decided that he would find sponsors and that he would get his friends involved. Eventually, they actually sent an ant colony into space, the first ant colony to be sent into space. And now all of the people who were involved in that experiment, all the young men and women, have been given scholarships or help in order to pursue scientific careers. Whereas there was only about a 2 or 3% interest in science in that school, it grew to 52%. We have got to realize that we are entering in a world of incredible machines. In 1983 or 82, Bell Labs reported that that is the year 1982 when there were more computers on the earth than people. There are more than 4 billion computers on the earth. There aren't 4 billion people. So we're no longer in that sort of situation in which we can afford to ignore. There's some of us who have had a very unfortunate education, but as I pointed out in many descriptions of my own life, that my education was very unusual. Went right up and went right down. It went right up and went right down. At the age of 16, I was sitting the same exam. I was sitting my final exam. And then I sat it again at 17 and again at 18. I couldn't go any further because I couldn't enter university. In my country, Guyana, at that time, there was no university. Therefore, unless you came first for the whole country, that was it. You went to high school and that was it. Okay, it took me 10 years to get to university. I never entered university until I was 28. Most American students finish university at 22. So I didn't have any particular advantage. I grew up in the bush. Guyana is no bush, but I grew up in the bush. I didn't come out of that bush until I was 14, yet I had read every classic, major classic, Greek and Roman classic. It just happened to be around. I couldn't find anything to read, so I read it, and it didn't occur to me that there were people around who were reading things like Dan is the man in the van, and the cat sat on the mat. I never knew that they treated people in that way. Because there is nothing finer than the human brain at the very young age. We learn fantastic things because the brain is not finished. That's the only thing you're born with unfinished. It's not closed. Your brain is actually partially open. It may have a certain kind of soft skull around it, but the brain is not finished. The brain actually is not physically finished when you're born. You have to be extremely careful about that. Therefore, a lot can happen. Those early years are absolutely vital, critical years. That's not the years to start talking baby talk. Because that is the year where the fantastic computer, billions of years old, is spinning and waiting. Babies are not born vacant. You have to start filling them because they have this incredible machine that is ready to pick up things. And if you start playing with that machine and taking it for granted, obviously the baby is an emotional idiot. But not, there is a fantastic computer there waiting to pick up stuff. And those are very critical years. So nobody could say, unless they have a very extraordinary disadvantage, and I had extraordinary disadvantages. When I was 9 years old, I was dying. All of my friends died, with the exception of one friend, an American Indian. All of my friends died. We had a fantastic epidemic. The Anopheles mosquito attacked us. And when I was 9 years old, I had an incredible fever. It went up to about 106, 107. You cannot come out of fevers like that without brain damage. No way. I lost part of my memory. There are certain things I cannot do. I have no space direction. I cannot drive a motor car for a long distance without someone sitting beside me. I crashed 4 cars in 1971. I had to take one of them into the lake in order to cool it off. So talking about disadvantages, one has to be very careful about that, because while some of this is true, and it certainly is true here, there is no question about it that blacks the discrimination against blacks is so great that there is no question that they do not emerge with an equal education. But you do not stop there, because you have to supplement that education. There is absolutely nothing I have used in my books on African civilization that I learned in the university. I had the worst miseducation of the Negro. When I was 14, I was convinced that there were only 3 civilizations in the world: the British, the Greek, and the Roman. I never heard Africans had civilization. That was absurd. Nobody thought of that. I read Tarzan, and that was it. That was the African. And I was so grateful that the great white man Tarzan had learned enough of the apish behavior in order to protect his black cousins. And when the great South African liberal, as they called him, stated that the Negro is my brother, but he's my younger brother by several centuries, we felt so good that he could actually connect, even at a distant point, with us. We really believe we are the youngest people in the world. And when I went to university, it was worse. Nothing damaged me more than that university. I don't regret it. You must, if you have a chance, enter university, or at least learn certain structures. That is what I learned, certain methodologies for which I'm grateful. But when it came to information, I was the most misinformed Africanist in the world, because I was told constantly things. I was told, for example, Africans never wrote. That was in the 1960s. Nobody thought Africans wrote. They didn't know they had scripts. The English professors told me that Africans were pre-literate, and that it's quite possible that something was missing in their brain, and that's why they did not write. They did not have literate cultures. You could only study oral tradition because they wrote nothing. It took a long time. It is only a few years ago that I discovered that Africans had scripts, and as many as Europe. Europe does not have many scripts. Very few European tribes develop scripts. The English have no script. This is not English script, these are English sounds. Blacks in science, Anglo-Saxon sound. But it's not Anglo-Saxon script. They never had a script, that's Roman script. The English have no script, the Germans have no script, the French have no script, the Spanish have no script, the Romans conquered them and gave them a script. So you have a few Europeans like the Romans, the Greeks, the Russians who have scripts. Africa has as many scripts as Europe. It had the Mande script. They found thousands of inscriptions along the Sahara, going far back from about 5000 BC. They have found the hieroglyphic script, and everybody said, aye, but you see the hieroglyphic script developed in Egypt, and Egypt is not African. We will come to that later. But in 1962, they discovered that it's not even Egyptian. The hieroglyphic script is not even Egyptian. It was found at a place called Kusta in Nubia, on the edge of the Sudan, 200 years before it moved up with the blacks into Egypt. In other words, the blacks on the edge of the Sudan had already started using that hieroglyphic script, which was further refined and developed as the blacks moved up into Egypt. They found a dozen black pharaohs in Nubia, in what we would call Ethiopia, reigning before they moved up into Egypt. And at the conference in 74, the conference at UNESCO, Sav Soderberg, who was in charge of the Sudanese expedition, or the Scandinavian expedition to Sudanese Nubia, said that the techno-complex, that is the technology, the science of the Egyptians, is Africa. After all these years, they came to that conclusion by seeing the slow evolution of that science in inner Africa. Egypt is not a fluke. It was not a sudden flash. It grew out of, slowly evolved out of what was happening in various parts of Africa. We have found more than just scripts. We found the Mande script, we found the hieroglyphic script, we found the Akan script, we found the Himyaritic script, the Meroitic script. At UNESCO now, we have about 800 manuscripts in Meroitic which have not yet been deciphered. Our great friend and colleague Sheikh Anta Diop of Senegal came closest to deciphering the Meroitic, but he died a year and a half ago. And now we have a very extraordinary African who will be translated for the first time. I have had two brilliant translators translate his work for the first time. Theophilo Benga, you will see him in the new book which comes out at the end of July, Egypt Revisited. He's a very extraordinary man. He's a master of ancient Egyptian, ancient Greek, Latin, French, Arabic, the Bantu languages, and more. And he, perhaps, may be the man to make that breakthrough. I have been reading his manuscript with great interest, dealing with the African conception of God, which is so complex, and which you find not only the Egyptian, but running among the Dogon and the Bambara and the Bantu. A lot of people have assumed that these were just primitive ideas. Now, for the first time, out of the mouths of the Egyptians themselves, translated for the first time by an expert, Obenga, with a tremendous and complex knowledge of all these cultures, you begin to see that lots of what we've been told about what these people thought is not valid. Their thought was far more complex than we had first imagined. But let me come to the question of first of the science in inner Africa. The scripts astonish us. For example, there is a script that actually traveled from Africa to the New World. That's very unusual because the slavers made sure that Africans were not allowed to speak to each other. If you found an Ewe here and an Ewe here, you split them. You have to have an Ewe, a Fanti, an Igbo, etc. You have to find people who are not speaking the same language, because if they communicate easily, they're likely to revolt. They made one mistake in Suriname. They brought a great number of people over to Suriname, and there survived what is known as the Faka script, which Dr. Urshel of the University of Suriname has identified as a branch of the Akan script. And I found in 1981, visiting the Saramaka, a large African community in South America, found them writing the Faka script. I did not recognize it as a script. I knew that many people had claimed that these were just drawings, just like what they have in the calabashes and the canoes, etc. But it seemed to be so systematic that I presented it to authorities, and we found that in fact it was a script, and it was a branch of the Akan script, who have both a drum script and a written script. Now the Surinamese blacks were one of the few people who defeated the Europeans. When they ran into the heartland of Suriname, the Europeans ran behind them, but found they could not defeat them. In fact, they defeated the Europeans. And the Europeans sued for peace, and the Africans said, if you want peace, give us your guns. And they gave them guns, and they were able to maintain the peace. We have found mathematical systems. We did not know there were mathematical systems developed among African peoples, and why not? Because at the university, we found, as I said, here were my teachers. They were all world authorities in Africa. And what were they studying? They were always studying primitives. All small-scale communities, face-to-face communities, until we've come to the assumption that that is the norm. The little village that is the thing you study. Now that may be largely true today. After the shattering of Africa, we must remember Africa is not an advancement in the past. Africa suffered tremendous cataclysm. We know what happened to the black hair. We know as African Americans what happened to us. We were transplanted. Our imagination was colonized. Our assumptions about many things have lacked continuity and connection with what happened before. So we thought that we were the only victims of this. And thousands of books have been written about the slave trade. That's old hat. But what happened to the African? The African has suffered a vast amnesia. This summer I'm going to speak to 3 universities in Ghana. I'm going to make it, I hope I will be able every summer to go to some African country to speak to its major universities. Because they have got to recover, as we have got to recover, these shattered fragments of our past. This is not just a romantic enterprise, this is an absolutely vital psychic and psychological necessity. We will not be able to escape the fragmentation of our psyche until we can pick up the significant parts of our history and make ourselves whole again. And part of the tribal warfare that occurs in some places has to do with grossly unfair demarcations of people that occurred during the colonial period, and also the lack of a sense of a common history among many Africans who therefore think that we are Ghanaians and we are this and we are that and we are Nigerians and we are this and we are the Igbo and we are the so-and-so, etc. Those things come when you do not realize that in the high points in Africa, like in Egypt, etc., that these things became possible because of threads running from all over Africa. It is not a sudden thing. It's not a separate thing. It comes out of these curious fusions. And that only when we begin to realize that we find that common ground, that unity beneath the underlying fundamental unities that enable us to see ourselves as a people. That does not mean we lose our separate identities, because the Jew is a Jew. He has his own special thing and nobody fights against that. He has a right to treasure his special identity, but he's still an American. But we suppose some of people want us to abandon our connection and continuity in order to be Americans. That's not possible. And I'm not suggesting integration, and nor am I suggesting separatism. I'm merely talking about people who are aware of themselves as part of the common world and of man, but at the same time there is also they are aware of the wealth, the richness that springs from being aware of the fact that they're plural, not singular. We're not Africans or Americans, we are, in Jesse Jackson's words, African Americans. There is this connection and continuity so that we have this rich heritage. And it has been made extremely poor by the way we have been treated, the way we are conceived of, the way we still conceive of ourselves, because we are not free of these prejudices against ourselves. I remember in reading Invisible Man, when the 2 black boys were in the ring at the beginning of the novel of Invisible Man, they were fighting. And they had blindfolds around their eyes, which was very symbolic and significant because they could not recognize themselves as brothers. They were fighting for the entertainment of the white Southerners. And because of a blow, the central character had his blindfold slightly shifted so that he could get a glimpse of the absurd reality of his situation. And he says to the other black boy, "Let's fake it, man. We don't have to kill each other. Let's fake it." And Tatlock, the other boy, said, "No, no, no. I'm going to beat the hell out of you." And he said, "Why? For them?" He says, "No, for me. Because there's no longer me and them. he has internalized their hatred of him, so that he has to project that hatred on his own brother. He participates in that consciousness, so that it's not longer a question of color. It becomes part of his world. He rejects himself. You know how many prisoners, every time I open my mail, half of the mail come from prisoners trying to rehabilitate themselves, realizing for the first time after they've been forced to give a lot of thought to what was happening in their lives, how much they really hated themselves. It's not just poverty that drives one to crime, it's also a poverty in their interior poverty, a deep sense of unworthiness that sustains one in the state of helplessness. And we find it even among people who have breaks. You go into the classrooms in the universities here, and you see people who've been given a chance to go to university, and they don't want to do anything. They don't want to do anything. They want to do the least possible thing to get the best possible grade, and they believe they're going to go out in the world in their ignorance and their mediocrity, and they're going to make it. And if they don't make it, the first thing they're going to say, oh, it's because they're discriminating against me, which is partially true. But part of it has to do with the fact that a lot of us, because we do not have a ground upon which to base our self-image, believe that we have, because of our disadvantages, that we are inevitably mediocre. And that is not true. Even the one thing I realized when doctors told me there are certain millions of neurons that have been destroyed in your brain. And I looked around me and I looked at people and the way they behaved and the way they thought, and I said to myself, even if I'm left with half a brain, you don't need more than half in this place. We've got to have higher standards, and those standards have to be built upon our sense of vision of the past. A vision of what was possible, of what is still possible. You look at Tuskegee, Carver left there a long time ago. Do you know what they're doing now at Tuskegee? Students, they have learned to grow potatoes on the moon. They're growing potatoes in nutrified water. This is a big space experiment. This is students at Tuskegee. They're carrying the tradition forward. He went as far as he could with the potato. We're going to carry it one step forward. We're going to send potatoes to the planets. Now, that may have a slight absurdity in it, but it shows you the desire to continue something. In the space program, there was so much. I went there in 1983 and I was startled because, as I've said before, when I went to NASA to study what blacks were doing in space, there was only one black in space I knew, and that was Darth Vader. And when I asked them for information, they would come. We have a very good program, minority program, which is true. NASA probably has the best minority program. It has hundreds of black scientists. But they couldn't show me what these people were doing because they had never really worked out a way to deal with this problem, because they would say to me, yes, you know, science is neither black nor white, science is science, which is true. But because we have been discriminated against and are still are discriminated against on the basis of blackness, and whenever the question arises, people are so quick to say, well, what did black people do? That's why we have to find out what we did. It was surprising to find that Dr. George Carruthers, a black scientist, had developed the most advanced space camera. He was the first person. His ultraviolet ray spectrograph, which was taken to the moon on Apollo, was the first camera to take a picture of this planet from the moon. A first camera to take a picture of our solar system from another body in space. Colonel Gregory, the first black to pilot a spaceship. Not Bluford, because Bluford was the first black American to go into space, but this was the first black to pilot the spaceship. And he was responsible for major inventions. He is our leading technical astronaut. He, for example, devised the micro-instrumentation landing system. And I had a chance to meet him at NASA, and I was very interested in that one because it affects the safety of our aeroplanes. He has developed a system where the computer locks the plane from the ground and brings it down safely whether the pilot is blind or drunk. Now that's very important because I spend a lot of my life in airplanes, and I always remember this incident some years ago when I was flying into Flint, Michigan, and it was snowing, and I felt so happy because whenever I see snow I feel merry because snow is associated with Christmas. There's no snow in my country. I never saw snow until I was 24. So whenever I saw snow, it was artificial snow on the Christmas tree. So when I see snow, I go crazy. And I remember doing that in London. I took off my winter coat and ran into the snow and I got pneumonia. So I'm sitting in this airplane and I'm looking out and everything is absolutely white and the snow is coming down and I feel this lift. And we're going down, we're almost on the tops of the trees, and suddenly the plane made a violent lunge upwards as if it had been hit by something, and people screamed, the woman behind me vomited. And then about a quarter of a minute later came the voice of the captain, "Sorry about that, we just couldn't see the runway." And that thing frightened the hell out of me because I did not know in all that snow this guy with his industrial eye had to see that runway. And that I thought it was all computerized and the plane had to know how far up or how far down it was, etc. But he has got this micro-instrumentation landing system. He's developed a whole range of things. He is one of the 3 men who actually goes into the spaceship and checks it out before it goes off. He's the man who was chosen to redesign the cockpit, the brain of the most advanced machine, the space shuttle. Then there were other people like Major Gillum, who was at the conference as one of the keynote speakers of the conference I attended a week ago. He was the leading black at NASA. He was the director of the Dryden Flight Center, and he actually supervised more than 1,000 of our space scientists to develop the space shuttle. He saw it from babyhood to blast off. We don't know about these people. Our young people need to know that this is not the end, that we are not in some kind of pit. We're in a difficult situation, but it's not a bottomless pit. There are things happening, things that our people are doing we know nothing of. It is not just in the space program. You go in Bell Labs and you're startled by black genius. One of the most advanced things in telecommunications today is glass fiber light guides. Something thin as the strand of a human hair. It can take information coded in pulses of laser light and send it flying at the speed of light. Channels, many channels in something thin as a human hair. It's not possible without black scientists. It is a black scientist, Northover, who did the mathematics that changed our whole understanding of glass, that enabled us to take 4-foot rods and stretch it for 6 miles. It was a black scientist, Cannon, who went onto the streets in Chicago to test the glass fiber light guide. He was the man who was in charge of the team that had to develop all the tools in order to take those light guides onto the streets. And it was a black man, Al Richardson, who went with the cable ship, the Bell cable ship, and actually laid the glass fiber light guides on the ocean and wrote the first guidebook for the world to show them how to put that thing on the ocean floor. And he developed a laser alarm to let us know when it twisted and was likely to break so that it could be dealt with immediately. He had a laser alarm to let us know that information. All sitting in the same New Jersey, an obscure little state like New Jersey. These 3 scientists at Bell Labs, the largest private research facility in the world. Have you ever heard of them? You've never heard of Richardson or Canon or Northover? The foil electrics, the lapel microphones we use, they have foil electrics which are critical. The co-inventor of that is right in New Jersey, a black scientist, James West. He's sitting, there's a picture of him sitting in the anechoic chamber, the quietest room in the world. And he's been able to develop microphones as thin as sheets of paper, so sensitive that if you stand before them, it could pick up the beat of your heart. We don't know about these people. Our young people need to know about that. When they look on television, they see black men beating up black women. Those are images. And that doesn't mean that it lacks authenticity. That happens all over the world. But why is it that's the only thing we see? When you see any great black film, you go and check it out. There's some brutalization going on. There's nothing to be proud of. How could I not believe that there was no civilization in Africa when there was no book that showed me that? There was no teacher that taught me that. There was nothing I could read or learn. And that is happening in African universities too. How can you rebuild people, reconstruct them? It doesn't matter if they have oil or if they have wealth. All that happens is that the white face changes to black face, so the black becomes powerful. But if the black mind is the consciousness that was inherited from his master, he's going to behave the same way or worse. So we have got to understand politics is not enough. Cultural revolution must precede political revolution or go hand in hand with it. It must go hand in hand with it. The Russians are learning that. They talk so much, learning about the democratic revolution, how it would be the masses the masses would have a voice. It would be the dictatorship of the masses of the proletariat. That's not what it turned out to be. After 70 years, yesterday or day before yesterday, it was the first time the Russians had a breath of a free election where they could actually speak their minds. What went wrong? Because the consciousness of that time, in spite of all the theories, etc., had been so heavily poisoned. Look at Nigeria, the same thing. We will do this, let us smash the British, and when we get the British out, we will do this and that. And they had marvelous opportunity, a population as great as Britain, with oil. And after a few years, you look around, you see, something never happened there. There was a rebellion, not a revolution. They seized power, yes. So there were black faces in power, but their minds were messed up. The colonization of the imagination, that was not over. They had seized power, so there was a surface thing, so they could make big stuff. We have won. Political revolution. There's no political revolution, that's a rebellion. A revolution involves a change of consciousness. And therefore it has to go hand in hand. It must go hand in hand with shifts in power. We have to train our young people. They have to be prepared. You do not take power unless you become responsible, because you will not know what to do with it. We have found so many things in Africa. We found the Dogon, for example. They had run when they found that the Europeans were murdering tribes on the way. They ran into mountain fastness. So for a long time we thought they were primitives. Then they were studied by Marcel Griol and Germain Dietelin. They found that the Dogon had plotted an invisible star. This was just one of their things. One is just sampling, because there's so much. There are 3 massive books coming out now on the Dogon. The Pale Fox is one of them, coming out in English. We are stunned by the intelligence and the sophistication of these Africans. The Dogon had plotted this invisible star. About 5 or 6 centuries ago, they had a ceremony to this star. They said although it was one of the smallest stars, it was like a seed in the galaxy. It was the heaviest type of star in the galaxy. Do you know what that means? This is a star you cannot see at all with the naked eye. The Africans not only saw it, they plotted its orbit up to the year 1990. Our machines show they're dead accurate. They were able to intuit its mass. Although it was so tiny, it was an imploded star, what we call a white dwarf. They said that it was so heavy that if all the creatures on Earth were one lifting mechanism, they could not budge it. We have discovered it is the heaviest type of star in our galaxy. They said it was made of a bright metallic iron. We have found it to be true. They said it had an elliptical orbit of 50 years around its parent star, Sirius A. We have found that to be true. They said it has an orbit on its own axis. We don't know that yet. They said that there was an object flashing and darkening, contracting and expanding within the region of this Sirius B. Do you know when modern science discovered that? 3 years ago. Einstein orbiting satellite found the object the Africans were talking about. They mentioned that 5 centuries ago. You're not therefore dealing with idiots, because all of these systems of thinking are built on the assumption that the reason why you study the primitive is because you have to see where we first began, like how we study monkeys in order to see how man jumped into symbolic universe from the land of the monkey. You study black primitives because you could see where society began, the little kinds of simplicities, and then you jump into advance. And these simple people are in advance. Some of them, not all, because no world develops in that equal stage. You have high point, you have cultural centers. If therefore you study primitives and you ignore the cultural centers, many of which evaporated or were shattered, then you have no idea of what was going on. You have no idea. It is like going to Europe. I spent 10.5 years in Europe. I've been in parts of Europe where they never saw a black man in all history. And I went into villages where I found as many as 12 Europeans using one outhouse bathroom. They did not use flush toilets. They were aware of it. They didn't use it. They never showered. They had baths, but they didn't shower. Okay, now that would be most unfair for me to write a big book about that village and say, this is Europe. It is in Europe. It is authentic. I saw it. But it's not. It is authentic, but it's not the truth. It's not the truth in the sense that even though it's a partial truth, it's worse than a lie, because that's not the way to represent Europe. Europe has gone beyond that point. So why do we do this with Africa? And it's not only done by whites. You send a black out to Africa on a holiday with a camera. They always search for the worst things they could find. They don't want anything to be proud of. They're being told by Europeans, the African is such and such, the African is such and such. Therefore, how do I capture the African? How do I prove that I went to Africa? Let me get something like that. It's not a joke, it's dead serious. Because even though it is authentic, it does not give you a sense of the very best that was possible. They found mathematical systems as Lasky found it. Why didn't we find it? When I was at university, nobody told me the Africans had mathematics. Why didn't they find it? Because they were looking for it in the bush, and in the desert, and in the little village communities that didn't need it. When they went among large African communities that had existed, that had encouraged and promoted intensive and extensive trading with other countries, they found Africans had developed indigenous mathematical systems because they needed it. But if you didn't study the large group, then you don't find it. Just like they didn't find the scripts. they just automatically assumed there were no scripts. And they assumed that about medicine. We've always thought that the Africans had some hocus pocus when it came to medicine, the little herbs here and there. That's not true. We find that they had vaccines long before Edward Jenner. Long before Jenner, the Africans had come upon the vaccine by puncturing the skin for beautification and identification markings, and they soon learned that you can introduce a germ in small quantity to build an immunity against the larger dose of the germ. Here in America, a slave called Onesimus told Cotton Mather about the smallpox vaccine because it had already been developed in Africa. There's a new stuff done on medical contributions of black women. Black women had brought medicine from Africa. They have a whole range of cures. We found tetracycline, a major modern antibiotic. We found tetracycline in Nubia. It was found in the bones of Africans 14 centuries old. They found the lowest incidence of disease among these ancient Africans because they were using tetracycline as an antibiotic. Do you know when we started to use tetracycline in the 1950s? They found aspirin among the Bantu. The Bantu were using Salix capensis, a root which is salicylic acid, the main active ingredient in aspirin, long before modern science picked up on aspirin. They found urbane, which we took into our system, capsicum, physostigmine, a breakthrough in eye science where the Africans had developed a solution for dealing with certain eye diseases. It was synthesized by a black scientist here, physostigmine. The Coca-Cola comes from the cola drink that Africans were using for centuries. Probably put a little more caffeine in it to sparkle it up, that's all. Reserpine, the first drug that was used to treat hypertension and psychotic disorder, they found Africans had introduced that. It was used in Europe, cowpectin. That's an African drug for diarrhea. It has a different name now, it's a different brand, so you never recognize it. There are pharmaceutical companies all over Africa studying herbal medicines today because they're beginning to take some of this very seriously. When you see films about African medicine, it's always the witch doctor, and they don't explain to you that in medicine there's a psychological treatment and there's hard treatment where you give the person the medicine. Now it's very important to have certain sorts of rituals which can assist in healing, because if a person thinks that they're being affected in a certain way, you can have a theatrical treatment which actually cures them. In addition to that, you can introduce scientific, already a hard concrete medicine. You have to look at this here in this book. Dr. Finch explains this in great detail. Dr. Finch has recently done a study of a medical treatise done by Africans thousands of years ago. It's known in the Edwin Smith Papyrus. It was copied over in the 18th dynasty. Dr. Finch showed me this is long before Jesus and long before the Greeks, the top Europeans, were even aware of these things. That they had only translated 1/3 of the book which dealt with the brain, the head, and the neck. They had more than 200 terms for things inside of the brain and outside. They had found the actual locus in the brain that processes auditory information. We only discovered that a few decades ago. In fact, a few years ago, some of the things Dr. Finch showed that only been discovered recently through X-rays. That the Africans had come upon a long time ago, the pulse. Herophilus was credited for the first work on the pulse, the Greek. We find 1,000 years before him details about pulse taking in great detail, something so complex that it took 1,000 years later for Europeans to catch up on it. These things are not in the books. That's why I speak now to scientists all over the country And they sit with amazement. And you say to yourself, look, what is this? I'm not a scientist. Here are these specialists. How come they don't know about this? No, but because there is a deliberate, some of it is unconscious, but some of it is, if it's African, it can't be anything. So why bother with it? It's like I entered the lab. This is the only, it's a whole island called Plum Island in New York State. The only lab that studies exotic diseases of animals. I had to be sprayed before I went there, and I had to be sprayed after I came out, and they told me I'm not to touch any animal except the domestic cat and dog, which is familiar with our diseases. You can't touch any, you can't go on a farm a week after you leave that lab. And when I went to lecture, I saw on the map rinderpest originated in Africa. And when I gave my lecture, I said, I have to point out that rinderpest did not originate in Africa. It originated in Europe. It was taken to Africa, and it destroyed a lot of cattle in Africa. One of the scientists, he was well trained in this. This is his field, not mine. He said that he objected to Van Sertima saying, so when it's clear on the map that so and so, the head of the unit, the head scientist got up and says, I'm sorry about that, but Van Sertima is correct. It is a European disease. And they're learning it. No, they're learning it. It's still there in the map. He said we should have updated that. Now if that, and I'm not saying anything against Jews because some of my best friends are Jews, but if that, but no, I'm very serious about that, they are. But if that was a Jewish thing, he would have lost his job. I'm sure there would have been a big uproar about it long before now, but because it's a black thing, does it really matter? Do you have to change that? Unless some smart black man comes in and notes it. It doesn't matter. What does it matter? It's just like the whole, let me not go off because I was going to say something else and it takes me away from my subject, okay? Let me come back. Because we know a lot about diseases and who gets credit for them, etc. But to come back, you look at other phases, look at navigation, look at plants. I noted in my book, They Came Before Columbus, I spent a year on botany because I realized when I was writing They Came Before Columbus, and it came through curious revelation. Now when I came to this country, and I came by pure accident. I never intended to come here. I came by pure accident. And I had been invited to Guyana by my prime minister. There was some literary conference there, and since I had written poetry and I had attempted novels, etc., I was invited as a writer. And when I was there, I met a good friend, Jan Carew, and he said, why don't you come over and visit me? I'm in Princeton. And I said, Jan, you don't understand. I've been without a job for years. I give a broadcast every week. I only earn 8 guineas a week. I could barely survive. I can't pay for a passage. It's just because they invited me here that I came. And he says, look, I'm going to give you a check. And he wrote me a American Express thing. And he gave it to me, and he says, when you get to Port Authority, give this as payment for your bus to Princeton. And when I got to Port Authority, and I gave it, guy says, there's no signature here. So there I was stuck. I did not have a penny. This is in 1970, not a penny. Because the only money I ever had for years was, I never bought clothes. I went to garage sales where they gave away clothes, or sometimes I got a jacket for $1, well, what you would call an American dollar. And I wore shoes for 2 years, 1 pair of shoes, so I was extremely careful. I only had money to eat. And rent was another great problem. So here am I stuck at Port Authority, and I'm begging this bus, this ticket man. I said, look, when I get there, my friend will pay for the bus. He says, no, you can't get on the bus, and an old lady heard me, and she gave me $3 and something cents it was then, and I got on the bus to Princeton. Now I spent that weekend in Princeton with my friend, and strangely enough I came upon a book in his library which he'd taken out to the Princeton Library, African, the Discovery of America by Leo Wiener. And I read that book. I didn't finish it. Fortunately, I was offered a job in America, and I came back months later and I started to read these books, this trilogy. And I knew enough linguistics to know that he was on the right track, but part of what he was saying did not add up. In other words, he was jumping the gun. I mean, he was not all there, but some of it was valid. And I wrote an article the next year actually attacking the thesis of African presence in early America, saying that it was not a proven thesis. And I ended by saying, if anyone could show me one head with African features clearly and unmistakably African, then I would begin to believe and to take this seriously. And I sent it off to Random House to be published in an article in a magazine called Amistad 2, which fortunately never came out. And a few days later, the editor, Charles Harris, called me and he says, a strange thing has happened on my desk. You ended your essay by saying, if anyone could show me a picture, and underneath your essay, something had just come from Mexico, showing a picture of blacks in Mexico, in ancient Mexico. And I said to myself, how could I ask a question, throwing it out into space, and in the same desk, in the same room, on the same day, the answer comes back? And that, to me, struck me with such force that there is almost a consciousness that if you throw out something, it comes back in that strange way. And I began to realize that there was information in the world, but you could not, all the books had been so written that you had to really go through all of them, thousands of them, before you could find the bits and pieces. It is like if Africa was a shattered diamond, an exploded world, and that there were things all over the place, and that you had to really search through all the disciplines to find them. You take the case of botany. They found in the lab in America, when they took the two cultivated cottons of America, Gossypium hirsutum and Gossypium barbadens, and they put it in the lab, they got a shock. They found that 26 chromosomes, 13 were African and 13 were American. Now these are ancestral cottons. They were here 2,000 years before Columbus. Long before that, 2,000 years before Christ. And they couldn't understand how could the African cotton, a domesticated cotton, cross with an American ancestral cotton 2,000 years before Christ. Now, nobody knew then about plant domestication in Africa. They did not know the Africans had domesticated plants along the Niger. They did not know that the major plants in Egypt all came out of the Sudanic agricultural complex. And in fact, that many of the plants that they were thought were Asiatic were later found to have come out of Africa, that they were mere variants or mutations of African plants. So that really shocked them, and the man who discovered that, Stevens, he said, well, perhaps it floated from Africa by itself to America. The contempt for the African was so absolute. Obviously the African can't move because he's a primitive. You see how the study, once you concentrate and you get one type of African, and you think that that constitutes the African, everything is affected. So he set up in his lab a tank in which he tried to simulate the salination, that is the saltiness, and the temperature of the Atlantic to see if the cotton could float by itself from Africa to America. The cotton sank after 2 weeks. Wouldn't give up the experiment. He said to himself, perhaps it will sink below the current, but it will remain submerged, clinging to driftwood, and come to America. In the 3rd week it died. So he had to abandon that. And then Proctor, another botanist, suggested birds flew from Africa to America with the cotton. Now you know, As we know today, we discovered it only 3 years ago, that the one man on the earth who's traveled more than any other man is African man. They discovered, for example, that in Europe there are no Europeans until 55,000 years ago. The only people in Europe were Africans. The Africans were not only in Africa, they were in Europe. That came out of 3 laboratories, 3 major labs. It came out of Oxford, the most conservative. It came out of Hawaii. It came out of Berkeley, where they discovered that Africans were not only the first people, there were no people but Africans. Now that's nothing to suggest that Africans are superior. What it suggests is that we are more intimately related than we thought, because out of the African came the European. This is clearly established now. They can actually track it back. They can track it back in the blood. They can show from the analysis of polymorphism, DNA polymorphisms, that about 55,000 years ago, the African began to lose his pigmentation in the ice of Europe. It took about 10,000 years on the extreme conditions where he could not assimilate the little sunlight that was available to him without shedding the pigmentation, which was so critical to deal with ultraviolet radiation in the tropics. So that this has nothing to do with superiorities or inferiorities. Those were ecological imperatives that occurred in various places, and that the Asiatic came about as a result of mergers between the stabilized Africoid type and the type that mutated in Europe. In some cases you have the Africoid. There's 100 million blacks in Asia today. If you want to see the evidence of that in the faces, read African Presence in Early Asia. And you will see the Aryan invasion of India, where the attack on the black type, known as the Dacias by the Aryans, and the battles that ensued, and the destruction of the Mohenjo-Daro and Harappan civilizations. But to come back to science, the reason why I wandered into those things is because I want you to be aware that every time we found something, it opened a new door. And as you enter the new room, a new door opened again. We began to discover all sorts of things, that plant domestication had occurred, and that it had traveled to America because there was navigation. The Africans had boats. The Chinese report that 2 centuries before Columbus, Africans brought elephants to them in ships to the court of China. You will see pictures in African Presence in Early Asia. You will see African noblemen having negotiations with Chinese in the court. This is long before Columbus. And they show currents. They've shown a map. There are maps we have found now, the Piri Reis map, which is in, they came before Columbus, that shows Africans had crossed, that they had actually mapped the part of South America. They had mapped the Trata River in Colombia for 300 miles. They have the correct latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates, which Columbus did not have. Columbus struck out for the latitude of Japan, hoping to land in India. He called the Caribbean the Gulf of the Ganges. He called South America an island. He called Cuba the continent. And we're still calling the Americans Indians, because that is what this place was called until it was later changed to America from Amerigo Vespucci, his friend. And as I told Congress, we have got to stop talking about Columbus's discovery. Because it is very contemptuous. Not only is it contemptuous of the Native American, it simply is not true. Because as I said to them, I'm not the first person to suggest there were Africans in America before Columbus. Columbus was the first person to suggest it. He actually says so. He said on his second voyage that when he was in Haiti, the Native Americans came to him and told him that black-skinned people had come from the south and southeast in large boats, trading with them in gold-tipped metal spears. And the whole evidence is presented. The metallurgical evidence, the botanical evidence, the linguistic evidence, the oceanographic evidence, the cartographic evidence. You can't play with that anymore. It has become so precise. It's just like DR people, many blacks seem to think that it doesn't matter what you say, people are not going to believe. That's not true. That is not true. Everybody believed for centuries that the Egyptian language, with the exception of people like Massey and a few extraordinary Europeans, everybody was made to believe that the Egyptian language is Afro-Asiatic and Afro-Semitic and Afro-Hamitic, etc. Until Diop stood up for 6 hours at UNESCO and ran down thousands of interconnections, so intimate, so familial, linking threads to the body of African languages that everybody caved in. Nobody could contest that. UNESCO had to say, in spite of all the differences they had at that conference, that for the first time they were unanimously agreed that Egyptian was an African language. So I want you to be aware that the development of these facts, as they become more and more precise, it is impossible to deal with them. We've been arguing for a long time, was the African the last man or the first man? You know, I sat at the table in New York, for example. I was invited to give a speech to a very exclusive organization. I shan't call their names. And when I was sitting at the table and everybody thought by feeding me I would get all nice. And I am a very nice man when you're talking with me. It's when I get up on the stage that I get crazy. And they didn't know that. So I'm sitting down and I'm enjoying my meal and we're all talking softly and nicely. And this guy said, you know the question about who was the first man and who was Adam and Eve and so has not yet been settled, it could still be Asia. And I said, we have to stop this nonsense. I mean, this has been going on far too long. I mean, with all that we have discovered now, and my voice rose, I stopped eating. With all we have discovered now, you could still dare, he was my host, you know. You could dare talk about Asia as the home of man when they have found so much skeletal material establishing beyond the shadow of a doubt that it is Africa, millions of years before Asia. And when we have such machines now that you could actually go into the blood and check it out and show at what point that mutation started to occur, it is no shadow over anyone. It merely shows that we are more intimately connected than we first thought. And he started to tremble and so forth. And I looked up, everybody was uncomfortable. And I looked up and I saw his wife smiling quietly. Nobody noticed that. He'd probably been beating her on the head for years. I don't mean physically, but I mean so proud of his opinions that she'd never had a good chance. And she was so happy that I was with. She gave me some extra ice cream. It's very important. They were very angry with me, however, when after I gave my speech, before I could give my slides, one of them was saying, get him out of here, fuck. Tell him there is not enough time to show slides. Anyway, what we are finding is so astonishing. In every field, in the field of medicine, in the field of astronomy, we found that Africans had an astronomical observatory in Kenya 300 years before Christ. That they had put 19 alignment points to a series of stars and constellations, and on the basis of those alignments they built one of the most accurate of prehistoric calendars. We have found scripts, we have found mathematical systems, we have found breakthroughs in surgery, eye cataract surgery in Jenny in 13th century Mali. The cesarean section, which is very difficult because there's no place to there are two very difficult places to operate on: the brain and the stomach, because here is where there are masses of things. And in the European world, as late as the 1870s, whenever the cesarean section was performed in a woman, she died. They could save the child, but not the woman. And because of the British Empire, English doctors heard that the Africans were performing the cesarean with total success. A team under Dr. Falcon went out to Africa and studied how the Banyoro surgeons performed their surgery. They noticed the Africans had both anesthetics as well as antiseptics. Now that was very unusual, because Lister had only introduced antiseptics 2 years earlier in his operating theater. Many European doctors did not realize that death lay at their fingertips, that you couldn't just wash your hands with water. You had to have a sterilizing solution, otherwise after the operation, no matter how skillful you are, your hands will kill the patient. That after you close the wound, the germs from your fingers will tear her to pieces. They found the Africans had their sterilizing solution. These are the savages. They studied how they collapsed the abdominal wall. They studied with astonishment how the Africans had mastered the use of the cautery iron. They could take hot irons and stop internal bleeding almost instantly with minor tissue damage. They studied how they stitched. They actually drew the stitches and brought it back. The cesarean section was performed with far greater success afterwards. You never hear those connections later. Nobody talks about them because we have not been in charge of history before. We never had any say in it. We were just told things and we took it for granted. And it is only now we're beginning to make that probe, and we're not alone, because scientists from all over the world are beginning to bring a new dignity to African science by finding things that had been ignored for centuries. And here in America, and I want to close by pointing that out with great force, the story is not finished, because in so many fields we find the African American has made breakthroughs. In the Caribbean, what made Britain and France such powerful nations in Europe was the sugar in the Caribbean. Who was the man who built the machine that could take cane juice and turn it into sugar crystals? It's black. No, but really you, who came here to the United States. Who built the first machine to mass produce shoes? Jan Matzeliger. Who lubricated the machines at a critical stage in the machine age? Developed something that could self-lubricate the machine. Elijah McCoy, whom we call the Rail McCoy, not even knowing the Rail McCoy is a black. Who built the automatic stoplight which still regulates traffic all over this planet? Garrett Morgan, who also built the first smoke inhalator mask and actually entered a fire and saved 36 people using his smoke inhalator mask for the first time in public. Who was able to transform the food industry, the food transport industry in this country, when we were primitively transporting things with ice blocks. Who refrigerated our trucks, introduced portable refrigeration in the trucks so as to save the food. Who gave us induction telegraphy. Who was able to change the harpoon, producing the movable harpoon that literally doubled and made safe the whaling industry across the world. Louis Temple of Black. And who gave us light? Edison started on the light. Edison, genius, yes, he initiated the work on the electric light, but Edison could only burn that light for a day. It is Louis Latimer, a black scientist, who invented the carbon filament, the extraordinary thing where you could get incandescence without the kind of heat that would burn the bulb. We are able to burn that for thousands of hours a day all over the world because of Louis Latimer. And he wrote the first book on incandescent electric lighting. And he went to London, when it was the greatest city in Europe, and literally supervised the lighting of London. He supervised the lighting of New York. He supervised the lighting of Philadelphia. And you see so many films on Edison. There's a whole section of New Jersey State that is called Edison. Have you ever heard of Latimer? I went to scientific societies where they were celebrating Latimer, and they didn't even know exactly what he did. We become such a careless people. You know, when I went to Egypt last summer, the one thing that struck me with enormous force was the incredible precision of the early blacks. I'd read in books of how they'd abandoned an obelisk. And I asked one to see this abandoned obelisk, because I learned one thing: the best way to learn about people is to study their failures, because that is where you know the secret of their success. And I looked at that incredible obelisk to find the flaw, the microscopic flaw. Why did these people abandon an obelisk? It must have taken incredible, those quarries, you look in those quarries, you see the standardized blocks of stone. And you want to know what kind of black people were this, who could cut through granite, who could restructure mountains. You go and you see those mountains, they rip it, cut valleys through them, cut rooms right into the heart of the mountain. They couldn't be doing that with stone tools. They couldn't be doing that with bronze. As Diop, the great physicist, showed, the bronze would break. They had to have developed something more. They had iron. And he showed that the iron they found the Egyptian world was an advanced type of iron, that they were not in merely the Bronze Age, though they may not have had sources of iron at that time, until later on at Meroe, when they retreated. They had ironworks at Meroe, but they were using special tools. Because when I looked down at that thing and I said to myself, my God, how could they cut this thing? You touch it, you see the incredibility of this thing. Look at the Japanese. The Japanese are supposed now to be the smartest people in technology. Do you know they went to Egypt to build a pyramid? A small one. Using the methods they believed the early Africans used. Didn't work. So they went further. They started to use their technology. They couldn't do it. They could not do it. They abandoned it after using millions of dollars. That's the modern technology. When the Russians had finished building the Aswan Dam, and the teams rushed down to save things the Africans had built, they couldn't move. The cranes broke down. They couldn't move some of the objects the Africans moved. They found pictures showing that Africans had developed something they could throw on the ground that would immediately turn it smooth as glass. Mixtures that they could roll these heavy objects over. They looked at those pyramids. Do you know what it is to have built that pyramid? It is half of the height of the Empire State Building, but it takes up 12 blocks of Manhattan. No single building on earth has ever been built like that. They say it has so much stone that if it were cut into 1-foot cubes, it would circle 2/3 of the belly of this world. That is what these people were involved in. Let us go back in consciousness to these people, because this is a light that burns forever. They're the only people who've been able to preserve themselves until today. You go and you look at some of those mummies, you're not allowed to look at them anymore. We have pictures of some of them. The beautiful African princess Anutawi. You could still see the grain of her black skin. You could see her teeth. You could see her eyebrows. You could see the texture of her hair. She's thousands of years old. No people on earth have been able to preserve their dead like that. No people have built anything that has lasted so many centuries. If it had all disappeared, then we have an excuse. We didn't know about it. We didn't know what our ancestors did. We did not know anything. We could not correct ourselves. We could not redeem ourselves. We could not make ourselves whole again. We have no excuse. It is there. It stares to us now. It is our great inspiration. It rebukes us. How can we continue to accept our mediocrity when we have come out of ancestors who would abandon a slightly flawed rock because they wanted to be perfect, as near to perfection as was possible? Because the Egyptians believed that the world was still constantly being made. They had to remake things. They had to bring it as close as they could to standards of excellence. This has to become our model. Europeans look to their models, and sometimes they claim things that have nothing to do with them. Herophilus is supposed to be the pulse taker when his pulse taker occurs 1,000 years before. And as I told one of the Greek societies, do not be afraid that you're giving anything up, because civilization is a blending and fusion of genius. We couldn't have a space program unless Hitler left his scientists. So it's not American genius only. It had to draw upon that world. There could be no great Greek science without Egyptian. There could be no great Egyptian science without all the wealth of Africa over those many centuries. And we could not have survived to speak as we do now in spite of all that has happened to us unless something was kept alive. There is a spiritual thread that runs through us. There is an ancient electricity. There is a power, a dynamism that is still very much alive. It is a spark in our history. It is like something we could plug into. Something that feeds us, something that turns inside of us, something that burns inside of us. And if we are to be whole again, we must pick up those shattered pieces and move forward, creating a new people, a new man, a new society. Thank you very much.
Professor Ivan Van Sertima. Professor, we're going to attempt to show some slides that he brought that will show you visually what he just spoke about. But as I
These are just a few slides that will give you some impression. All of these are found in this book and much more. This is something that was found in Tanzania, along the lakes of Tanzania, where they found that Africans were smelting steel 1,500 to 2,000 years ago. It was thought at first they were merely smelting iron, but when they found the slag from the machine, they found that it was the finest bloom of carbon steel, and that it achieved temperatures of 1,850 degrees centigrade, which is 200 degrees higher than anything achieved in Europe until the 19th century. And this was done just after the birth of Christ, or at the most modest date, about 1,500 years ago, about 500 AD. Next. These are the higher people. This is what is most astonishing, that although Africa had been destroyed its centers had been destroyed, and these people no longer produced steel, yet they were able to reconstruct the smelt, just based on things that had been passed down to them for centuries. We found an astonishing thing like that happening during the last war, when Africans did not have any iron because of the problem of transporting iron. They went back, some of them went back and started to produce a fine iron based upon things that they had done before. One of the astonishing things about this too was the fact that they were producing it in a single stage process, whereas in Europe, even as late as the 19th century, carbon steel was produced in a two-stage process, which was inferior to the African process. This is at Namarutunga in northwest Kenya, 300 years before Christ, where they found Africans had built an observatory, an astronomical observatory. This is the Dogon plotting the orbit of Sirius B, an imploded star which is impossible to see with the naked eye, plotting its orbit right up to the end of the 20th century, up to the year 1990. This is the oldest evidence we have of a number system. This is known as the Shango bone, found in Zaire, the Congo, 8,500 years ago. It's 8,500 years old. This is from Zimbabwe. The Africans built a civilization in Zimbabwe 800 years ago, and this is one of the walls of the great enclosure. An attempt has been made to destroy it, and it was found to be the most remarkable constructions in stone ever built outside of the Great Wall of China. And they could not understand how Africans could have built it, so they said the Portuguese built it, Arabs built it, the Phoenicians built it, the Chinese built it. And none of the prototypes of these buildings have been found in China, Portugal, the Arab world, or in Phoenicia. And it's recently been established that the Shona have prototypes of this. Here is the conical tower in the royal enclosure. When this was finished, you could stand in the top of the royal enclosure and see the slightest movement of a trader or a merchant 30 miles away. This is the Caesarean section drawn by Dr. Felkin after observing it among Africans. This gives you some idea about early boats. This is a building block for expansion and extension techniques. Here are dugouts in Africa holding 3 camels aboard ship. The dugout was a mere simple building block because, as they showed, there were a range of other ships in Africa along the Niger and the Nile. Along the Niger, for example, they have sewn plank boats. They have boats as sturdy and wide berth as the Carthaginians. They have boats that are like the boats of the Egyptians, the papyrus reed boat. They have like the catamaran in the Pacific, double canoes, but much sturdier. This is a ship that was used 1,000 years before Christ. This is used by the Swahili on the Indian Ocean. There was such a respect for African shipping that the Mughals of India made African people the cities, admirals of the Indian Ocean, because of the respect for their shipping. And the Chinese put Africans, most of the Africans in charge of the coral diving industry because of their respect for African diving and knowledge of the water. The Chinese, as I said, report Africans bringing elephants to them in ships 2 centuries before Columbus. This is the boat that Africans used in 1969 to cross the Atlantic. Haidal financed it because Haidal showed that this boat was used 1,000 years before Jesus, and that it could cross the ocean even as early as that time. Scientists scoffed at it. Scientists said that it's made of papyrus reed, and if you put papyrus reed in a tank, if you put papyrus reed in the ocean, it would get waterlogged and sink. And they tested it in a tank and it sank. And Haidal said if I took a piece of the Queen Mary, which is made of iron, it would also sink. So that it was tested on the ocean in 1969 on Abdullah de Jibrin and the Paduma people, and it crossed the Atlantic right up to Barbados. These are the currents in the Atlantic, off the Cape Verde, off the Senegal, Gambia coast, and off the southern coast of Africa that take things towards America, South America, the Gulf of Mexico. Shows you the latitudes of those currents. The most extraordinary map found in the ancient world, a map which could not be drawn by Europeans. It was found in 1513, but it could not have been drawn by Europeans because Alvarez Cabral did not get to South America until 1500, and no Europeans had mapped the Amazon. They had not mapped the Trata River. This map shows in detail 300 miles of the Trata River. It shows the correct latitudinal, longitudinal coordinates between the African Atlantic coast and the American Atlantic coast. It shows parts of the Caribbean islands. It shows the Gulf of Mexico. And it starts from where the currents start of Africa. It was found in Egypt, Cairo, in the Sackline of Alexandria. This shows you how Africa was connected before it was shattered, how you have riverine connections and caravan connections that move from Cairo all the way down to parts of the Atlantic. This is the Piri-Reis map again. This is the map found in 1513 in the Sackline of Alexandria, going back hundreds of years. This is something I found in the Virgin Islands, which turned out to be a script at St. John. This was verified as the Dawson Crescent script, the Tifinagh branch of the Libyan script, by Barry Feld, the Department, Barry Feld from Harvard and Department of Antiquities in Libya. It reads, plunge in to cleanse and dissolve impurities. This is water for ritual ablutions before devotion. It's found in the Caribbean and predates Columbus. This is Jan Matsalega, the shoe lasting machine, the first machine to mass produce shoes, which we still use. It was known as the niggerhead machine. This is the graphite lubricator developed by Elijah McCoy, the first introduced into machines, the first machine that could self-lubricate. This is Granville Woods, railway induction telegraphy. He was responsible for 35 major inventions, Granville Woods. This is the first machine to make sugarcane juice into crystals, white sugar crystals. This was developed by Norbert Review. The machine is still used today with slight variation. This is the first removable cooling unit, the first portable refrigeration introduced into trucks, which transformed the food transport industry in this country. Frederick Jones responsible. This is Louis Latimer, and this is his invention, the carbon filament, which was to transform the lighting industry across the world. This is one of the black scientists who worked on the atomic bomb. 6 black scientists helped to develop the atomic bomb on Einstein. This is Dr. Lloyd Portman, who's now dead, whom I interviewed in Chicago some years ago. He's not only responsible for that, he was responsible. He changed U-235, uranium-235 into uranium-238, and set the basis for the development of the first nuclear research facility in this country at Oak Ridge. He also invented the diamond window, which was a new way of looking at certain things in the atmosphere which could not be seen with the normal eye. He also was responsible, the first person to suggest that you could synthesize blood, but he was not allowed to continue with his invention. Now the Japanese are ahead of us in that. Well, the Japanese have started to synthesize blood, but his funds were taken away from him. He was also responsible for combining various compounds and producing new gases and compounds in the world, things that had never occurred in nature. As he pointed out to me, if something was made of 3 molecules, 1 above and 2 at the bottom, he could take one and move it to the bottom, or he could take one completely out. He could transform the structure, molecular structure of matter, and thereby was responsible for major breakthroughs in linking things that were never linked before. This is in Bell Labs. Here we have Brian Jackson, who's been able to develop a machine that could place, that can inscribe circuits that are so small they're almost invisible. And he could put it on one wafer, he could put 64,000 bits of information. This is glass fiber light guides, thin as the human hair. Here is one of the chips, which smaller than a postage stamp can carry thousands of bits of information. The glass fiber light guides I talked to you about, where Canon, Northrop, and Richardson are responsible for some of the major breakthroughs in this glass fiber light guide industry. This is Jesse Russell. And I don't understand his mathematics, but he's involved in doing something very extraordinary here, where he is building a smart data terminal, which is to be used for network management. These are the glass fiber light guides. This is James West, who was responsible for the breakthrough in lapel microphones, the foil electrets. Also, his invention has been used in hearing aids, various other devices. Here he is in this, what is known as the quietest room on earth. If a pin dropped in this room, you would pick it up. This is the anechoic chamber. This is him here with his electron microscope at Bell Labs. This is Major Gillum IV, who directed the Dryden Flight Research Center, who supervised the work of 1,000 of our scientists to build the world's first space shuttle. This is Dr. George Carruthers, who sent the most advanced camera into outer space on Apollo. This is Colonel Gregory. He redesigned the cockpit of our space shuttle. He was responsible for designing the cockpits of the 80s. Here he is sitting blind, that's not the sky, sitting blind in the middle of an airplane, landing it on the point of a pin by the use of his micro-instrumentation landing system, a computer that locks the plane from the ground and brings it down safely. Here is his alternate power controller, which cuts pilot fatigue in half, which may be introduced in many of our airplanes in the 90s. Here is me meeting Colonel Gregory the day before the blast off of Bluford at Kennedy Space Center. These are tires of the moon buggy that were devised by the black engineer Cherney, Robert Cherney. These tires are collapsible. They had to be extremely light. They had to be able to have traction on the crystalline surface of the moon and carry weight of the scientists and their instruments. This is the KC-135-09 aircraft, the only aircraft we have which flying on a parabolic curve achieves weightlessness. And here is Shirley at the bottom here testing a laser crystal machine. He spent more time in this machine than anyone else. It's known as the Vomit Comet at NASA. And this is a Hispanic from Brooklyn. She, along with the black American, Dr. Long, are responsible for major breakthroughs in our space medical program. We have, when we go into space, it's an incredible experience because space is not just the green world. All the colors of the world, all the colors in the spectrum are in outer space. It is an unbelievable experience, and because you achieve weightlessness, you could come out of your spaceship and you could somersault in the air, you could swim in the air, you could walk in the air. But it also means that because you're weightless, you have other physiological changes which are very difficult to deal with. For example, you may sit down in your spaceship and when you come down on Earth you find you can't walk anymore. You have to train yourself to walk. This is what happened to one of our early scientists. He eventually, I believe, committed suicide. He never recovered his balance. This does not happen now, but involves a new space medicine. We, for example, developed a machine. Dr. Collins and Dr. Long developed a machine which quantifies yoga. In 6 weeks, you can learn to tell your heart go down. You can tell your blood pressure go down. You can actually train yourself to deal with what we have come to accept in Western science are involuntary muscular and nervous systems. So this is very important. When you're in outer space, blood could come from your legs and float up into your head. All sorts of strange things, so that you have to train yourself before you go out into that strange world. This is Dr. Patricia. So that was Patricia Collins. This is Phyllis Darden. Christine Darden, sorry, Dr. Christine Darden. She's in charge of hypersonic research in our space program. She's a very extraordinary woman because she has taught us how to crinkle the bubble. There are waves that come out of the wings of airplanes as we fly faster, and they create an enormous bubble which, when it bursts, explodes eardrums and windows for miles around. She's taught us how to reshape airplanes so that we can crinkle the bubble and deal with what is known as sonic boom factor. And here, finally, this is me some years ago when I was at the space program. I'm giving a copy of my book, Blacks in Science, which came out that same year. One of our young black astronauts, so he wouldn't get lost in space. Now, I am very sorry that I have classes at 8 o'clock tomorrow, and I'm leaving 2.5 hours from here. So I will be most grateful if you keep your questions for the next time. We will be returning here on April the 19th to talk about Egyptian science, and I will be quite willing to entertain questions.
Dr. Ivan, just hold 1 minute. Hold 1 minute. We came in unity, let us leave in unity. Just hold this spot 1 minute. Now, the secret to our success is going to be for us to be unified. So let's not all run to the door at one time. And I would like to say to Dr. Van Sertima's books is on sale here. His tapes are on sale here. If you're interested in the videotape of tonight's lecture, you see Minister Clemson Brown or see me, I'll give you his phone number and how to get in touch with him. Also, for those of you who haven't eaten your dinner, the sisters downstairs kept the kitchen open. If you want to go down and take something home for you, especially sisters who don't feel like cooking tonight, stop on your way down and take a home dinner with you. But before we leave, I want to say to you, I want to thank you from AFRO, from the members of AFRO, from the House of the Lord Church. I want to invite you back here next Wednesday. Especially, I'd like to invite you if you wish to come on Sunday morning to our services. And I'd like to say to you that there's several people in this audience who I admire, who was pioneers in organizing lectures like that. The sister sitting right here, Sister Miriam Francis, who's a great artist and sculptor. There's a brother way up there in the balcony, Otto Neal, one of our great artists. I always point these people out, but we need to support them. And whenever we see the shows on our streets in the summertime, support these people because they work very hard to put out their work. And I want to say to you, thank you again. Stop downstairs and have a meal. And before we leave, say, in unity, there is strength. Now say